Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is tutor2u.net/sociology. And once you're on there, you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so my guest for this episode is writer, Associate Professor of Sociology and entrepreneur, Dr. Jasmine Harris. Jasmine, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
How are you, Jasmine?
I'm good. You know, we got slammed with some snow yesterday and today, so just digging our way out, but otherwise pretty good.
Excellent, excellent. I always ask people to start by telling us a little bit about who they are, what they do, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I'm an Associate Professor of Sociology. I'm a race, class, and gender specialist, which means that I focus on the ways that racial, gendered, and class identities impact people's experiences. More specifically, I'm interested in the ways that being Black and a woman or being Black and a man specifically impacts your experiences in predominantly white institutions like school, for example.
Yeah. So do you look at other areas? We'll come back onto education because I know that's the main area. Do you look at it within other institutions as well?
I am starting to, it was really focused on higher education for the last 5 years or so, but I'm starting to also look at medicine. So I have an upcoming project that looks at how Black women experience infertility treatments in the United States specifically, where we know that Black women have more maternal deaths than white women. And so I'm interested in what happens before they get to that pregnancy piece and how the sort of institutionalized racism within medicine and the healthcare field in the United States impacts them.
Great. Thank you. And before we get into education a little bit more, I always ask people kind of how their journey in sociology started and who kind of their inspirations are as well.
Yeah, so I'm one of those people who fell in love with sociology at an early age. I was 18, my first semester of college, and I took an introduction to sociology course with what can only be described as like an old hippie guy, and he just opened my eyes to concepts that explained a lot of things that I was experiencing or had seen and heard, but didn't have the language for. And so sociology, right from the beginning of my introduction to it, was something that I knew that I wanted to pursue. I wouldn't go back and get my Ph.D. for another, 10 years or so, but it's always been top of mind for me. What I love about sociology is that it's happening around us all the time. And so it can't be avoided, but that also means that there is this sort of unlimited possibility for study. One of the things that I love about this discipline and why I went into study to become a sociologist was because there is so much innovation in terms of research methodology and topic and community focus that I think hasn't been touched on yet that I'm excited to, try to make a dent into.
And in terms of your inspirations, other than your hippie-like lecturer, I know you quote Alice Walker on your website. I wondered if there was anyone else similar that have really kind of inspired you.
Sure. Patricia Hill Collins is probably my biggest inspiration. She's a sociology professor. I believe that she's at Maryland, or she was at Maryland at one point. But her Black feminist thought and connected Black feminist epistemology, this idea that we don't have to study the communities that we come from with the same amount of distance that has been traditionally advocated for in this discipline, has been really important to my own methodological journey and topical journey as well. Patricia Hill Collins, A Different Kind of Citizen, which came out in 2009, I believe, talks about the ways in which school creates citizenship. And that was really foundational to my thinking about institutional racism and the experiences of Black people in those settings and what it means for their lives sort of long term as we work together communally to decide who belongs in what spaces and who doesn't. So she's a big inspiration to me. W.E.B. Du Bois, who is one of the founding fathers of American sociology, but is just now in the last 10 years or so being acknowledged roundly as such, is another who has had a big impact on my approach to sociology. Aside from the research on Black communities that Du Bois did, starting with the Philadelphia Negro in 1899, he also wrote poetry, and he wrote 5 novels. And I have also sort of been exploring different ways to use writing to get at some of the community issues that I'm studying using more traditional methodologies. So he's another that I, even though we're talking about 120 years ago, that I still come back to a lot in my own work.
Great. And you said about your methodologies. What kind of methods do you tend to use for your research, Jasmine?
Whatever methodologies I need to. I'm a methodologist, I would consider myself, but not a traditionalist. And one of the things that I think is really important, especially as we move forward as a discipline, is thinking about how best to answer these questions that we have about communities, particularly marginalized communities, that may be outside of interviews, ethnographies, focus groups, which are the more sort of traditional methods and methods that I have used myself. In my upcoming project about infertility treatment experiences amongst Black women, one of the methods that I'm going to use is personal journaling. We'll do interviews and we'll do anonymous surveys too. But given the sensitivity of this topic, it's likely that those methods alone are not going to give us the kind of deep picture that I'm looking for to sort of explain what these women are going through. And I should say that all of my work is about improving the lives of the communities that I study, right? So I don't just want to know what these women are experiencing. I want to know how reproductive endocrinologists and other doctors who treat infertility can better treat Black women given the data that I have. And if that's the case, then I have to be very mindful about what kinds of data I will get, via what kinds of methods. And it just seems to me that interviews and surveys, though probably the traditional approach to this kind of topic, are not sufficient. And so what I'm going to have my participants do is weekly journaling that they then will submit to me as the researcher. That will be another sort of interview level data set that I think will be really interesting and useful for this project. So, I've done spatial mapping using ArcGIS to map belonging and safety and connection on college campuses. I am getting into sort of narrative fiction storytelling as a way to fill in the holes that we have in terms of particular marginalized communities. I'm thinking specifically of Black communities of folks who have passed as white historically in the United States. We don't have a lot of empirical data about those communities, but that doesn't mean that their stories are not interested. And so sort of along the lines of Du Bois, I'm also interested in using the novel format and short story format. I'm not a poet in the way that he is, so I'll try to stay away from that. But, using those formats as well as a way to use storytelling as a method for understanding particular communities. So I'm always open to new methods. I'm one of those people that's knocking on the door of geographers so that I can figure out how to use ArcGIS or, SPSS to analyze more quantitative methodologies. But I don't think of myself as using one or two more specifically. They're always decided by the topic, by the community, and by the research questions at hand.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. The appropriate method for the appropriate piece of research, right?
Right. It sounds like such a simple thing, but I think in all disciplines, but I'll speak to sociology because that's the one that I know the most. We are trained to use, these 3 or 4 very specific sorts of methodologies. And often, and I've come up against this as well, there is a resistance amongst reviewers at journals with, academic presses to publish things that go outside, of those 3 or 4 methods that we're used to. But I think that we're starting to see a shift, and I'm certainly an advocate of us sort of disciplinary getting out of that traditionalist way of thinking about using methods.
Yeah, definitely. There's so much diversity out there. Why not use it at your disposal? I agree.
Exactly.
And so you've already mentioned briefly about your research on higher education. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So over the last 5 or 6 years, I've really been studying how higher education as inherently white supremacist, and especially in the United States, predominantly white, impacts Black students in a variety of ways, whether that is potential exposure to STI diagnoses, or the ability to feel a sense of belonging on predominantly white campuses. And I can say about that research that one of the things that was most interesting to me was that where students felt like they belonged, where they felt safe, where they felt connected and comfortable was not indicated by the institution's desire for how buildings and spaces should be used, and instead was defined by the students. And so the institution can say, we created this space to be inclusive and for a diverse group of students, but that doesn't mean that the space is actually being utilized that way, and doesn't mean that an inclusive and diverse set of students feel like they belong or that they feel safe and comfortable in those institutions. And so it was really interesting to see in a map, this is the project where we use the visual spatial mapping to see mapping this particular campus. This is supposed to be an inclusive building, but most students of marginalized identities say that they don't belong here. And one of the reasons that they don't belong here is about just a numbers game. Who has decided to take over that space based on the numbers that they have, and what then does that do to other folks who are interested in getting into it. Right now, I'm actually working on a TEDx talk called "Why Colleges Are Inherently Racist and What to Do About It," because the biggest thing for me in my study is acknowledging that because colleges and universities, and I'll speak specifically to the United States, but as I understand in the UK, this is also how it has historically happened, that those spaces were for white men originally. And very little, institutionally has shifted since their inception. And in fact, a lot has been done, especially at schools that have long storied histories like Vassar College, which is where I went for undergrad. They're doing a lot to maintain, the historical connections to the foundations of the college, while ignoring how damaging that may be to students who don't feel the same particular kinds of historical connections. In the United States, slaves did a lot of work on some of the most prominent college and university campuses for the first 200 years of their existence, most of which has been wiped away, or exists only in the institution's special archives. And so when institutions talk about bringing in students and alumni to create this institutional family, what they're doing is, ignoring all of the ways in which I, as a Black woman in particular, cannot be a part of that family or have not historically been a part of that family. And so then what does that do to the way that I'm seen on campus? The connections that I'm able to make, the social capital and cultural capital that I'm able to develop alongside this human capital that's supposed to be really valuable to me post college. And then the other piece, that has always really interested me about colleges and universities, and one of the reasons why I wanted to couch my research in those spaces is because of the continued prevalence of racism, of hate crimes. We have seen hate crimes on U.S. college and university campuses increase over the last 10 years, in some cases twofold. And that's really sort of diametrically opposed to the way that college and university presidents and administrators, especially over the last 4 or 5 years, of the Trump presidency and the presidential campaigns, have talked about transitioning these institutions to be these more inclusive spaces. But that requires a complete reorganization of the institutions rather than an additional grant here, a change in policy there, a required race and racism course. Those things are sort of piecemeal Band-Aids for what is sort of larger structural and cultural issues at these institutions. And that's really what my research has been trying to get at. And so since May, and I should say I'm from Minneapolis. And so the George Floyd murder was very impactful to my experiences, both personally and professionally, and continues to be. One of the things that emerged immediately following his murder were all of these statements from university presidents about what they were going to do to address white supremacy on their campus and racism on their campus. And much of that was just talk. We're seeing now that we're in February of 2021, so we're 6 or 7 months removed from that incident, and we're not seeing a lot of the shifts that were promised at that time, and those institutions who are making some shifts, again, are doing it in this very sort of superficial, what I describe in an article that I'm writing and a TEDx talk that I'm putting together as passive action. Things where they don't have to think or act very critically in terms of the overall institution, and instead can think of racism on campus as individual. Right. And so what we're trying to do is keep individuals from being racist or parse out individual racism. And I think that ignores the bigger issue. And so all of my research over the last couple of years has really been focused on bringing that sort of hypocrisy to the forefront, to challenge, in a lot of ways, these presidents to do better.
Yeah. Yeah, and ignore my ignorance, Jasmine. What are the percentages in terms of numbers, in relation to the percentage of Black people as a population compared to how many go to university or higher education?
That's a great question. So in the United States, Black people make up about 12.5% of the overall population. So we're still certainly a minority compared to white folks who are about 72.5% of the overall population. On college campuses, that number is much smaller. Predominantly white campuses, on average, between 4 and 6% of students are of Black identity. And even smaller percent, somewhere hovering around 2% of faculty are of Black identity in these spaces. So it's a not insignificant number, in terms of the small percentage. On the campus where I teach right now, we have about 1,400 students, and about 4% are Black students. So a little less than 100 at any given point. And you can see, how that may be a detriment to their experiences on campus.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because lots of sociologists talk about this idea of the habitus, somewhere where you feel comfortable, where you feel accepted, where you sit naturally. And I guess that's kind of what you're talking about, isn't it? That the environment itself doesn't lend itself to feeling comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. And, habitus is a great concept to use there because a lot of Black students, I should also say, even if they're not first generation, but many of them are, haven't developed the same level of connection to these campuses that would allow for that kind of comfort. And this is also where the issue of legacy students comes in. Those legacy students have a whole different kind of habitus developed at these institutions that Black and brown students just can never have. So, for example, at Harvard, the class of 2023 is 25% legacy students, and legacy students are those students who have family members who have also graduated from that institution. So you're talking about almost a quarter of the incoming student body population who has some external previous connection to the institution. They know the spaces, they know the sidewalks, they know the buildings. Their parents know the buildings. They've heard stories. Perhaps they've even attended alumni events at these institutions. I have a friend from college whose father went to Harvard, and she likes to tell stories about going to his alumni events growing up, right? And that allows you to develop a different kind of comfort and preference for that kind of environment that Black students really don't get in the same way. And so we end up spending a lot of our time on campus trying to develop that, in a way that our white counterparts already have. And so we come to the institution from the very beginning at a deficit in that way. And that makes it more difficult to develop those really important kinds of human capital and cultural capital that are the reason, frankly, that you go to schools with these kinds of names.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
And can I ask you a question? Because I've seen this debate quite a few times, and it raises quite an interesting argument that many colleges, based on what you've just said, are trying to provide environments that are multicultural, they're for everyone. And then if you have separate safe spaces for different groups, is that a good thing, or does that then become divisive? It's quite a difficult argument, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've certainly heard the argument that those kinds of quote unquote safe spaces can be divisive because they're not allowing for the kind of like mixed engagement that the institutions are looking for. But my rebuttal to that is always that the institutions don't have control over the kinds of engagement that happen in those sort of quote unquote mixed inclusive spaces, right? And this came out of the mapping belonging project that I did a couple of years ago, where because my safety, as a Black student cannot be guaranteed in mixed company, quote unquote, then that is inherently an unsafe space for me, regardless of how the institution intends for that space to be utilized. And on predominantly white campuses, if belonging is in part about numbers, right? Feeling like you have safety or feeling comfortable because you're not in the minority in those spaces. And it's unlikely that there are many sort of non-separate, safe, identity-based spaces where I can be ensured of my safety. And so in not having those kinds of like multicultural, identity-based safe spaces, what you're doing is creating additional emotional and psychological stress, potentially, for students of marginalized identity, because now there's nowhere I can go where I can completely let my guard down. I constantly have to worry because I understand that, these are mixed spaces and there's not always someone there institutionally to police my safety, and guarantee my safety. That, now I'm stressed, now I'm anxious, now I'm depressed about my role on campus. And we do see in social psychological research that Black students on predominantly white campuses disproportionately deal with mental health and illness issues compared to white students, like depression and anxiety, that they directly connect to not being able to feel consistently safe or connected on campus.
Could I ask you to unpack that a little bit more? Because, that's really interesting for someone to say that they would feel worried in that environment or they can't guarantee the safety. How does that manifest itself in terms of not feeling safe or feeling anxious? What would be the reasons behind that?
Existing racism on campus, right? So, for example, on our campus, we've had a lot of racist acts. Someone wrote the N-word in the snow a couple of years ago. Another person wrote the N-word in lipstick on a bathroom wall. We've had some altercations at protests against Trump, where pro-Trump white students have become violent in those exchanges. And it's the memory of that, right? It's not that in every space I go in, there is going to be violence or there is going to be racism. It's that because I know that these things are happening on campus, whether I experience them or a friend experienced them. And in a lot of cases, very little has been done by the institution to quell those events. Now I have to be on alert because though it didn't happen to me, it did happen. And that means that there are racist people on campus. That means that there are violent people on campus whose vitriol is directly associated with who I am. And if I know that, then I have to sort of perpetually be on guard when I enter mixed spaces, because I don't know who the perpetrators of, these racist acts are. I don't know what the beliefs of the person that I'm interacting with are, but I know that racism exists on campus because of the events that have transpired, right? So if I'm a student at the University of Missouri, for example, where I think it was 2 years ago, there were nooses hung on trees around campus. I don't know who did that, right? But somebody did. And now I have to be on even higher alert when I'm out in public spaces because I know that there's somebody here who not only hates Black people, but is willing to invoke images of lynching in that hatred, right? And so that inspires in me a sense of a lack of physical safety, and not just, emotional and mental, but then impacts my mental and emotional wellness.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of like an underlying threat, even though it doesn't happen every day, but you never know when it's going to rear its head, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And because we continue to see, according to, the National Educational Statistical Data, hate crimes continue to increase on college campuses, that those things aren't going away, So if anything, students, and this was especially true during the Trump years, marginalized students and Black and brown students, especially, their anxiety is being ramped up because, the public racism has also been ramped up.
And what can change her, Jasmine? Because I'm quite interested, you said about a lot of it is historical, the people that set up the school, who the schools were first being run for. Because you can't ignore that history, can you? You can't rewrite the history and say anything different if that's who the schools were originally for. So what can be done to kind of create a more welcoming environment, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I have some ideas about that. I think that first, institutions need to be focused on restorative social justice for marginalized communities of students and faculty on campus that have been targets of systemic racism. And that includes holding the institutions accountable for their histories. Yeah. I think that it requires an entire restructuring of the institution's sort of existing structures, not to repeat myself, but rather than these sort of piecemeal Band-Aid-esque policies and practices that are very reactive. I think that any changes need to be participatory, meaning they have to be driven by data collected from the most marginalized of us on these college campuses, and it has to be intersectional, right? This isn't just about race. How Black men experience racism on college campuses is very different from how Black women experience racism, is very different from how Chicano women or Chicano men, or indigenous folks experience racism on these college campuses, and sexism and misogynoir. And so there has to be a very intersectional approach. And then just more specifically, I think that there needs to be three things: structural change, cultural change, and local change. And so, restructuring of the policies for hate crimes, protections for whistleblowers who report hate crimes and racism on campus, a retraining of campus police, defunding of campus police as well, in terms of sort of structural change. Cultural change is more about the renaming of racist buildings and awards and chairs, that have historical significance but belong to those people who we now know were very racist in their ideologies. This is where, racism or anti-racism required courses and workshops might be useful. Pledging to only work with vendors and contractors who support people of color, employees, and then also local change. which I think is something that we often forget, is that these institutions are embedded in communities. And oftentimes all they're doing is taking, is taking resources from the communities, is gentrifying the communities around the school, ramping up the cost of living because of the faculty and staff and students who attend there. And so I think, institutions really need to pay attention to and try to shift what that relationship is between the institution and the community around them, particularly how the community's existence negatively impacts communities of color directly in those areas, and providing grant funding for community renewal projects and things like that, I think goes hand in hand with this. So, and all of these ideas are born out of the data that I have collected over the last couple of years, over the course of 5 or 6 different projects. And so there are things that can be done. I think institutions and the presidents who run them are often overwhelmed by the amount of things that need to be changed, and that is, it's understandable, but it also can't be used as a reason to stay stagnant.
Yeah. And you mentioned sort of cases and incidents of racism on campus are still high. Have you seen any progress though, Jasmine? Is there any schools or colleges doing it right?
I would, not to be biased, but my undergrad institution, Vassar College, the president, Elizabeth Bradley, has tried, to do, I think, as good a job as any institution that I have seen in adjusting some of these issues to try to prevent an increase, at least, of racism on campus. They have been at the forefront over the last 10 years for financial aid changes to be more beneficial to students of color, and to make colleges like Vassar more affordable, especially, as we see in the United States, the student loan crisis continuing to ramp up and creating this sort of economic bubble that may negatively impact our entire United States economy the next 5 to 10 years if something isn't done about it. They have also started recruiting veterans, specifically veterans of color, to campus as a way to continue to diversify the student body and the faculty as well. And they are starting, the acknowledgement of systemic racism, historic systemic racism on campus as well. And so, but I would say, just in response to your question, that there's no college in the United States that I've seen so far that is really sort of publicly and proactively trying to make these changes. What we have seen is an incident will happen, sort of like the George Floyd murder. Students, faculty, and staff will make comments about the institution's role in improving racism in the United States, and subsequently, as a reaction, those institutions will promise to do something. And it's the insufficiency of the somethings that continues to be a problem in the United States as we think about how to improve issues of racism on these campuses.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I interviewed Professor Gary Young in the UK, and he said exactly the same thing. You have these incidents, a lot of talking, things must be done, and then it sort of lowers its head again. It's sort of, it gets forgotten and swept under the carpet again. So it sounds very similar in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if there are folks on campus like myself who don't want to allow those things to get swept under the rug, what we end up in are, a lot of planning groups, strategy groups, discussion groups that are about talking about these issues, but that are not action-based. And that is really where we lose a lot of momentum in the United States, and it sounds like in the UK as well, is that the action gets slow in the aftermath of these incidences where, just sort of judging by all the things that I listed that these institutions need to do, action is really what is required. Perpetual action, 10, 15, 20 years of it is what is going to be required in order to really re-envision these kinds of institutions into the sort of anti-racist institutions that they claim to want to be.
Yeah, a long way to go. Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you very much for your time today. Would you mind just telling the listeners a little bit more about how they can find out more about you? I know you're on Twitter, or if they want to find out more about your work.
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at Dr. Harris J, Jay. You can also check out my website. It's Jasmine leah.com. And there you can find links to my work and little summaries about my research as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today, Jasmine. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.